work is this. When we see the book, it just says the freedom of the will. Well, now, if you read nothing more than the title, you would assume that he was endorsing the idea. Here's the full title: An Inquiry into the Modern Prevailing Notions of that Freedom of the Will which is supposed to be essential to moral agency, virtue and vice, reward and punishment, praise and blame. How do you fit that on the spine of a book? So you just shorten it to the freedom of the will. You can always tell a Puritan book, by the way, because the title is longer than most people's books. His text was Romans 9:16, "It is not of him that willeth." There were three authors that Edwards was taking upon himself to refute in this great work. All three of them were from England. The first was a man named Thomas Chubb, C-H-U-B-B. The second was Daniel Whitby. The third was Isaac Watts. He selected these three as being representative of differing theologies. Chubb was a deist. I'm sure that people made fun of his name. Here comes a chubby deist. A deist basically believes this. I'm just summarizing and simplifying. A deist believes, there's a God. He put us here and then he left us on our own. He is not involved in our lives in any way, shape, or form. Edwards believed that deism was where Arminianism was headed if an opening was given to it. Whitby was an Arminian and a minister in the Church of England. Isaac Watts was a dissenting minister and a theologian, largely in agreement with Edwards on most of his theology, but not in this one. So Edwards felt that by refuting these three authors, he was drawing a broad stroke across all theologies, and he didn't just single out one. I want to look at them with you one at a time. Chubb had first written defending Arianism in a book that elevated God and noted that Christ was inferior to God. In other words, God is God and Christ is not God. I remember that in the old mainline Presbyterian denomination, the United Presbyterian Church, in the late 60s, early 70s, one of the first death blows to that church denomination was when they ordained a man in the Baltimore, Maryland area named Mansfield Caseman. And in his ordination exam, they asked him, "Is Christ God?" And he said, "No. Christ is Christ, God is God." And they ordained him anyway. At that point, close the lid on the coffin, folks, the viewing's over. You deny the deity of Christ, you don't have a Christian denomination anymore. Now, it's only gotten worse since then. Just last week, the denomination approved the ordination of openly and active gay men and women. They said it's up to the individual churches what to do with that, but as far as the denomination, we approve of it. For Edwards, the Arminian and Arminian are two different things. I keep hearing an entire race of people being condemned to hell. People will say, "Well, I was talking with an Armenian the other day. I didn't know you spoke Turkey." Arminian is the theological issue. Armenian is just a person from Armenia, which is now Turkey. Don't get those two confused. Boy, I'd never become an Armenian. Well, you couldn't, really. But for him, the Arminian understanding of free will was the crucial point of theology and destroyed biblical Christianity. Now, many of his colleagues thought that a bad understanding of the effects of original sin had led to a bad understanding of the will. My mentor, John Gerstner, used to say that the doctrine of sin is the thread that will unravel the entire theological sweater. If you don't have a sound, orthodox doctrine of sin, you're going to be off on every other doctrine. People who have a problem with the doctrine of election don't really have a problem with the doctrine of election. They don't think sin's that bad. And therefore, it hasn't affected anybody. I have a little booklet at home I keep in my trophy case. It's just a little bigger than large Post-it notes, and it's called False Doctrines in the Church Today by Jimmy Swaggart. And it is his diatribe against Calvinism. I wasn't far into the booklet. I keep it just as kind of a trophy. I wasn't far into the book where I read this. I know that the Bible says that man is dead in trespasses and sins, but I still believe man can come to God whenever he wants. Why don't you hang a sign around your neck that says, "False teacher, shoot me here"? I know that the Bible says, but I still believe. You might as well just say, I'm damned to hell. One of the familiar stories Dr. Gerstner used to tell was doing a week-long conference on the doctrine of election. And this was in Westminster College, held in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. And after his first lecture, he said, a little old lady came up to me and said, Dr. Gerstner, I don't believe in election because I don't believe the Bible teaches it. And he said, Madam, I commend you. I applaud you. Don't you ever believe anything you don't think the Bible teaches. But would you commit to staying through the 4 lectures? She said, I will do that. So she stayed through all 4 lectures, and at the end of the 4th lecture, she found him and said, okay, Dr. Gerstner, you've convinced me the Bible does teach election, but I still don't believe it. And he looked at her, he says, Madam, I have no hope for you now. You're a damned soul. Not because you don't believe in election, but because you believe that God teaches it and you refuse to believe it. You can't say, I know that God teaches it, but I refuse to believe it. Again, hang a target on yourself and say, on my way to hell, would you join me? Edwards wrote The Freedom of the Will before he wrote his, quote, great doctrine of the Christian doctrine of original sin defended. He understood the problem this way. It is precisely by taking refuge in the autonomy of their wills that people avoid full-scale confession of sin. Because the Arminian view was that things did not have a pre-existing cause, and that the sinful nature was not an inclination to sin, therefore they didn't really choose sin and there was nothing to confess. For them it, quote, just happened. And remember how much time we spent in our last time together that nothing just happens? That's because Edwards is building to an argument. If each act, on the other hand, if each act required a conscious choice before the act could occur, then it enhanced the aggravation of the sin. If a sinner could stand before God, he says, why did you do that? You know, there's no reason, it just happened. Well, then you're not responsible. But if you have to take personal responsibility for your actions and say, it happened because I wanted it to happen, I chose it to happen. While we're getting ready for church on Sunday mornings, we sometimes watch TV programs on the religious channel. And the choir was singing the one I mentioned to you last time, I Surrender All. I was standing there yelling at the TV, liars, liars. And then they sang, I can't remember the name of the song, but Prone to Wander, Lord, I Feel It. Wander, prone to leave the God I love. You don't leave the God you love. At the moment you leave Him, you hate Him. You love yourself more than anything else, and that's why you're doing something contrary to what He wants you to do. How can a man say to his wife, honey, I'm going to go commit adultery, but I love you? There may be a little trust factor there. Or I've had affairs with this girl, this girl, this girl, this girl, and this girl, but you're still my best girl. Not going to last, not going to make it, not going to sit well. The opposite view diminished greatly personal responsibility, since each individual transgression was self-determined and not an expression of a deeper problem or inclination. In other words, and this comes out of Pelagianism. One of the terms for Arminianism is Semi-Pelagianism. Pelagius was a 4th century British monk who was condemned as a heretic and debated by the great Augustine. Not Augustine. Augustine is in heaven. Augustine is in Florida. Those are two different things, and only one of them is a saint. Pelagius denied that Adam's sin had any effect on anybody but Adam. There was no transmission of the sin nature from Adam through his posterity. According to Pelagius, everyone was born completely neutral. No sin nature, no inclination to sin or to virtue, and each man individually chose his own way. How do you explain the fact that every man born of 2 human parents has sinned, if there's no explanation for it? So the semi-Pelagian stance, or the Arminian stance, is that yes, sin has affected us, but not so much that we can't do what is right if that's what we choose to do. We just need more education. Does that sound familiar? We're the most educated society in the history of the world and the most debauched. Edwards explained it this way, that Arminians would hide behind their supposed inability, and they used that as an excuse. In other words, it's impossible for me to do what God demands. He can't really expect me to do it, and therefore my sin isn't that great because I can't help myself. That is the Semi-Pelagian motto, by the way. I'm not that bad, and God's not that mad. Edwards pointed out that not only could they help themselves, they weren't even doing what they were actually capable of doing. And so were justifying what they did by their supposed inability to do otherwise. In other words, if God asked me to be perfect, He knows I can't do it, so He can't hold me accountable for it. Yeah, who said? Well, it just seems to me. No. I'm talking about somebody intelligent. Who said that that wasn't the case? This was Edwards' response, by the way, to people who were not Calvinistic, but fatalistic. So they would respond this way: if God hasn't chosen me to be saved, there's nothing I can do, so why bother? We might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And Edwards would respond, you're not even doing what you can do. Are you going to blame God for what you can't do? What do you mean? I mean this, faith comes by hearing. So if you want to get saved, you ought to be in church every Sunday. Where were you this morning? Well, I was actually in the tavern. Faith doesn't come by drinking ale. You won't even do what you can do. But you're going to blame God for what you can't do. And then he would say, if you will do what is within your power, God may give you what is not. But he said salvation is so precious a thing, men ought to show God they really want it. Well, that was Thomas Chubb. We move on to Daniel Whitby. Daniel Whitby was a Church of England divine who first came to public attention because of his strong anti-Romanist tracts. He was very well known for his paraphrase and commentary on the New Testament, published in 1703, the very year that Edwards was born. Whitby was a strong anti-Calvinist, and he had strong Arian and Unitarian tendencies. In 1710, he wrote his discourse on the 5 points of Calvinism. So what Edwards was interacting with was the 4th discourse on the liberty of the will of man in a state of trial and probation. Here is a statement from Daniel Whitby's writings. It is better to deny foreknowledge than liberty. In other words, it's better to give man liberty than to give God foreknowledge. There was a movie a few years back called Bruce Almighty. I see some of you have seen it. Pastor Mark, take notes as to who needs to be disciplined. Now, I like to go to the movies. I like stories. And I went to see that movie when it came out. But I always examine movies theologically. That's why nobody ever wants to go with me. And what I remember from that movie is when God, played by Morgan Freeman, turned over all his powers to Jim Carrey. He says, "You have all the power I have at your disposal. You can do anything you want with it except one. You can't touch free will." Now, of all the things that he might have said, according to the scriptwriter, that was the most important thing there was. You can't touch free will. He said it is better to say that God doesn't know the future or that God does both know and doesn't know the future. You can see the openness of God theology 300 years ago. Edwards argued that if God knows the future with certainty, which he argued on the basis of God's absolute decrees, then the future is predestined and determined even though men make choices they want to make. When the question is, how can God know the future when it hasn't happened yet? The answer is because God has decreed the future. The rhetorical question is asked in Lamentations chapter 3, what is there that comes to pass and I have not ordained it? You know one thing, if it happened, God ordained it to happen. And there's no other reason that something happens than that God ordains it to happen. And yet, God has chosen to do that in a way that does not eliminate your choices. So somebody will say, well, if God is sovereign, man can't be free. Here's the question you ask him. Why not? Well, it just seems to me. No. I mean, give me an intelligent answer. Not it just seems to me. Who cares what seems to you? Since when did you become authoritative as to why things do or don't happen? God knows the future because he's decreed the future. Whitby strenuously denied the imputation of Adam's sin to the rest of mankind. He wasn't really an Arminian, he was a Pelagian. And it's no wonder he could plead the neutrality of man's will if he rejected any sinful influence in man. Mothers, how long did it take you to determine that your offspring were sinners? Doesn't take long. You know, there's one word you never have to teach a child. What's the word? No. You don't have to teach them that word. They know it from inception. In fact, David said in the Psalms, I have been a sinner since the moment I was conceived. But Whitby makes the same case as the Arminians do in asserting that it is not just for God to condemn our persons for not doing that which it is impossible for us to do. In other words, God said, keep the commandments. I can't. Well, then you're off the hook. If you can't, I guess it's okay. No. We move on to Isaac Watts. Edwards held Isaac Watts in very high regard, but was responding to his Arminian views on the freedom of the will that was held by this otherwise very orthodox English minister. Isaac Watts was well known in New England. He was a literary agent for a man named Benjamin Coleman, a close associate of Edwards. There were several men in New England at the time that Edwards was around that are almost as good. I mean, this is level A and then level double A, not letter B or something. Men like Thomas Foxcroft, Thomas Prince, not Joseph Prince, that guy on the television. This is Thomas Prince. And Benjamin Coleman, a close associate of Edwards. Isaac Watts sent books to the Harvard and Yale libraries. He collected money for missionary work among the Indians. He found donors to help fund Harvard College. He helped to pick textbooks and professors for that school. He was a personal counselor to many of New England's governors, and he wrote catechisms, hymns, and other texts that were used in New England churches and schools. And he wrote a strong endorsement for Edwards' book, A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God, which had been sent to him by Benjamin Coleman. Watts wrote a work titled An Essay on the Freedom of the Will in God and in Creatures. And in that book, Watts asserted that because the soul is of an active nature, in contrast to being simply passive material substance, its acts may come to pass spontaneously of themselves without a cause. Now there are always people that we think highly of, and then they do something really stupid. And we wonder, how could he be so orthodox on so many other things and miss that one? His major point in the work is that there are things perfectly indifferent in the mind's view concerning which the will determines without reference to prevailing motive or greater good. Now, this is actually what most people think of when they think of free will. Now, let's define our terms. There is free will, there is freely willing, and there is free willy. But that's a movie about a whale, and it doesn't enter into the conversation at all. Forget free willy. Free will, and here's the problem. If you ask people, do you have a free will? They say yes. They say, what do you mean by that? Well, I don't know. It means I can do whatever I want anytime I want. As soon as the person answers like that, you know something about him already. He's not married. What most people have in mind when they use the term free will is that I am completely neutral on any issue you want to bring up. I have no inclination to this side of the issue. I have no inclination to this side of the issue. Present me with the issue, and without any pre-existing notions or inclinations, I'll make a rational choice. If that's your definition, God does not have a free will. God is not neutral towards anything. God has a predisposition to holiness and His own nature, which determines all of His choices. In fact, in Ephesians, where Paul talks about election, he says all this was according to God's eternal purpose. It has always been God's plan to save sinners. That's not a plan B. It wasn't like He created people and then they sin and He goes, now what am I going to do? That's always been His plan. It's His eternal purpose to exalt the Son of His love by saving sinners. God is bound by His own nature. So are you. Now, if there was such a thing as free will defined as neutrality, you'd never do anything. So the wife and you are planning a barbecue, and you're going to invite all the pedo Baptists from Cornerstone Baptist Church, which means it'll only be you two. And you're preparing the hot dogs and the hamburgers and the grilled chicken, and she says, honey, we're out of mustard. Could you run over to Publix and get some mustard for us? Sure, honey, I'll go. 2 hours later, you come back. Where's the mustard? I didn't get any. Why? I couldn't make a choice. There was Heinz, there was French's, there was Publix brand, and I had no inclination towards one or the other. So I didn't get anything. If the will is neutral, you'd go to a restaurant and you'd starve to death because you couldn't make a decision on the menu. I remember years ago when I was teaching in the evening classes at MacArthur's church, on the way from my home to the church, there was a Wendy's. And I would almost always stop and get a Wendy's chicken sandwich and a large soft drink and usually a Frosty. The soft drink and the sandwich were the appetizer. The Frosty was the main course. And so I'd pull up at the church and say, "Oh, I see you went by Wendy's." I said, "Yes." "Did you do that of your own free will?" "No. There were factors involved. I only had $6 cash in my pocket. So I couldn't have gone to the steakhouse and gotten a steak and a baked potato. I was running a little bit late, so I only had 5 minutes to get in and out of Wendy's. I happen to like chicken sandwiches. Now there's 3 factors alone influencing my decision, right? How could I be said to be free or neutral towards that decision? Well, why didn't you stop and get a broccoli quiche? I can give you one very good reason. I hate broccoli. And I can't pronounce quiche. I can now, I couldn't then. But as long as there are any factors influencing your decision, you're not neutral. Now then, what difference does it make if a man is born with a sin nature? This is where the Bible says men love the darkness. They are not neutral towards sin. They love it. You can't be said to be neutral towards something that you love. If you love your sin, you're going to hate its opposite. If you love holiness, you're going to hate its opposite. In neither case are you neutral towards either one. Now for Edwards, he said this: man freely chooses whatever seems good to him. In other words, he is freely willing. You do what you do because you want to do it. Nobody forces you to do anything. The will can be changed, but the will cannot be forced. You see the difference? Jack Benny, who only a handful of us here will remember, had a famous routine where he was standing in Central Park, and a man comes and sidles up next to him, looks around, sees there's nobody there. He pulls a gun out and he puts it to Benny's head. He says, "Your money or your life?" And Jack Benny just stands there, and after a minute or so, the robber says, "I said your money or your life." Benny says, "I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it." Was Benny forced to give that money? No. He had a choice to make. Now, God's not holding a gun to anybody's head, and neither is Satan. You will do whatever seems good to you according to your nature. If it seemed good to you to be here tonight, there was never a chance in this world that you wouldn't be here tonight. And the reason I know that is because you're here. Now, inevitably, there's some young person, age 17 or under, who's sitting here with his hands full and say, "Yeah, this is what I want to do on a Sunday night, that's for sure. Listen to some old goat up there talk about somebody I could care less about." Oh no. You absolutely do want to be here, at least more so than the alternative. I remember telling my dad one time when I was a teenager and feeling my oats. He says, "All right, everybody in the car, we're going to church." I said, "I don't want to go." "Excuse me?" Now, my dad was a cop. And my dad was a German cop. And my dad was a big, tall, stocky, semi-angry German cop. I'll tell you a story about my dad just so you know what I'm thinking here. We were sitting at the dinner table one time, and my mom said something, and I didn't have then the self-restraint that I exhibit now to you. And I said something very disrespectful and very smart alecky. I'm probably 12 to 14, somewhere in that age. And my dad, faster than I can remember ever seeing a man move, reached across the table, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, dragged me across the table up to his face, and said, "That is my wife. Don't you ever talk to my wife like that again. Do we understand each other?" This was before there was a Dirty Harry. I'm convinced that Clint Eastwood owes my dad royalties for stealing that movie character. Well, that's the kind of dad I've got. So when I said, "I don't want to go to church," he says, "I said get in the car." "Nope, don't want to go." So he thought for a minute and he says, "Okay, son, you don't have to go. You don't want to go, you don't have to go. We'll be gone 3 hours to Sunday school and church. By the time I get back, I want all the sheets on all the beds washed, dried, and put back on the beds. I want the breakfast dishes done. I want you to go out and change the oil in the pickup. I want all the weeds hoed in the strawberry patch. I want the windows washed." And I says, "Pop, give me a second. I'll be in the car." He didn't force my will at all. He changed my priorities. Now, if you're here tonight, it's either because this is your priority or because someone changed your priorities. But you're here because you chose to be here. And there's not a person here who didn't do that. You always choose what seems good to you, but what seems good to you is based on an inherent predisposition. Why do I sin? Because I love it. Why do I repent? Because I love God more. What changes my behavior? When God changes my heart. That's why you need a new nature. God puts a new nature within you, and you still do what seems good to you. It's just that what seems good to you now is different than what seemed good to you before. Where you used to love sin and hate God, you now love God and hate sin. Not as much as you wish you did, but more than you used to do. The great UCLA basketball coach had a motto, and he said this about himself: "I'm not what I want to be, and I'm not what I ought to be, but every day I thank God I'm not what I used to be." That's called sanctification. So for Edwards, the issue regarding a totally free will is a simple one. Either contingency or the liberty of self-determination must be run out of this world, or God will be shut out. He said this: "If there is no absurdity or difficulty in supposing one thing to start out of non-existence into being, of itself without a cause, then there is no absurdity or difficulty in supposing the same of millions of things." How important is it then to establish God as the creator rather than something came out of nothing? Because if something can come out of nothing in the beginning, it can happen every single day. If there is no cause as to why there is matter, then there need be no cause why there's sin. It just happened. You see, theology is a system. It's not isolated little points of theology. Theology is not like a smorgasbord. It's not like you can go and say, "Okay, I want some salad and I'll have some mashed potatoes and the brown gravy. Can I get a little turkey over here?" "No, thank you. I don't care for the dark meat chicken. No, thank you." No. Biblical theology as a whole, you take it all. You don't get to pick and choose. That doesn't mean you'll understand it all equally all the time. I remember when we had someone to the house and they were not a believer, and I was showing them some of the teaching series I had and said, "Just pick one or two, I'll give them to you." He says, well, I'll take this one on forgiveness and this one on hope. No, I don't want any of that sin and hell stuff. Well, that's the way people are. They don't want any of that sin and hell stuff, but they'll take all the good stuff. They skip the mashed potatoes, they go right to the dessert tray. So you can see again how Edwards comes to the law of causality as a guideline for rational thought. He sees a single action of the human will causing the state of mankind to be vastly different from what it could otherwise have been for all succeeding generations. This, for me, makes the following question the most difficult to answer in all of theology. How could Adam and Eve have done it? They had no predisposition to sin because they had no inherent sin nature. How could sin have looked good to them? Think of it. You're Adam or Eve, depending on whichever gender you might happen to be. You're created perfect and upright. You're in paradise. Adam's the best husband who's ever lived. There's no garbage to take out, so he's never in trouble. There's no remote, so they don't fight over it. There's no in-laws, so they don't fight about that. They're the perfect mate for each other. And he is not a male chauvinist pig. He looks at Eve and he says, "You're the most beautiful woman on earth." And she said, "Oh, thank you, dear. You're the best husband I've ever had." They walked with God in the cool of the garden. They had intimate fellowship with God Himself. How could sin have looked good? That's a question nobody can answer. And if they do, don't trust them, because there is no answer to that. Then the next question is, how could they have sinned? Well, the only answer that has any credence and credibility is Adam and Eve were created perfect, but mutable. In other words, they were capable of change. The only one who's not capable of change is God Himself. God can't change. He can't get better. How do you get better than perfection? And He can't get worse, or He wouldn't be God at all. But Adam and Eve could change because they went from not existing to existing. That's a change. But there was a cause to their existence. It was the Word of God. If these volitions, each and all together, start out of nothing and come into existence, then the moral and historical world is so unordered as to be repugnant to both sound reason and biblical teaching. Here's what Edwards said. In such a situation, God must have little else to do but mend broken links as well as He can, and be rectifying His disjointed frame and disordered movements in the best manner the case will allow. In other words, God can't do anything about anything except clean up the mess after it. What kind of God is that? The supreme Lord of all things must be under great and miserable advantages in governing the world He's made and which He has the care of, though His being utterly unable to find out things of chief importance, which hereafter may befall His system, which if He did but know them, might make seasonable provision for. In other words, God is nothing more than a bystander. He's not the cause of anything. He can't do anything about anything. So all He can do is stand by and watch you and I make a mess of everything and then try to clean it up after us. Edwards said, "It is indeed as repugnant to reason to suppose that an act of the will should come into existence without a cause as to suppose the human soul or an angel or the globe of the earth or the whole universe should come into existence without a call." So for Edwards, to have a truly free will, we must be free from any hindrance or impediment in our choices. There's no such thing. God doesn't even have a free will. And neither do you by that definition. However, again, you freely choose whatever seems good to you. If anyone has an inclination or a disposition towards one side or another of an issue, the soul cannot be said to be free. So Edwards said the soul cannot choose without choice or prefer without preference. The mind is not indifferent when it determines itself, but would rather do one thing than another and would rather determine itself one way than another. Let me read you the lengthy quote from Edwards, and then we're just about done. This states the position of the Arminians, the Pelagians, and the deists as succinctly as he can, and then his refutation of it. The Arminian notion of liberty is that there is a sovereignty in the will, and that the will determines itself, so that its determination to choose or refuse this or that is primarily within itself, which description of liberty implies a self-contradiction. For it supposes the will in its first act, choosing or refusing to be determined by itself, which implies that there's an antecedent act of the will before the first act. Staying with me? You understand? In other words, for the will to be neutral, it had to make a choice, which means it had to make a choice to make the choice before it made any choice. So he's going again back to the fact that nothing can come out of nothing. There can be no fallacy in this, for we know that if the will determines its own act, it does not determine it without acting. Therefore, here is this contradiction, that there is an act of the will before the first act. There is an act of the will determining what it shall choose before the first act of choice, which is as much as to say there's an act of the will before the first act of the will. For the will's determining what it will choose is choosing. The will's determining what it will is willing, so that according to this notion of liberty, the will must choose before it chooses in order to determine what it will choose. Now, he is making fun of that system. Whether or not they get it, he's making fun. In fact, go back to creation, that it just happened. Before anything acts, it must first choose to act. This glass cannot move itself on its own. Either I must move it, or the wind must move it, or somebody later must move it. But we all know this, that if that glass starts there and it ends up there, somebody moved it. The glass cannot choose anything. So the fact that there exists anything shows that somebody chose that something should be here. And they did it by an act of the will. So I inquire, what determines the first act of the will? Its determination of its own act? Again, if there's an effect, there must be what? A cause. It must be answered according to the Arminian scheme that it is the will by a foregoing act. And here again we have the same contradiction, that the first act of the will is determined by an act before the first act. Now, Edwards is so dry and droll that to me this stuff is hilarious. If the will determines itself or determines its own choice, the meaning of it must be, if there's any meaning belonging to it, that the will determines how it will choose, and that it chooses according to that, its own determination how to choose, or is directed in choosing by its own determination. And so what you do is you go backwards into infinity. And the Arminian runs out of his own assertion. If the will chooses its choice, this is Edwards' point, if the will chooses its choice, it must be supposed to choose this choice. And before that, it would have to decide to choose this choice, and you keep going backward and back. And then you say, is there a beginning here? So why does the will choose what it chooses if there's no basis for the choice, is Edwards' question. And so he made the distinction between freedom to choose and freedom of choice. In other words, free will or freely willing. My first year in college, I worked at a McDonald's in a predominantly black section of Southern California. At that time, on the McDonald's menu, there were hamburgers, cheeseburgers, double cheeseburgers, fries, soft drinks, And our owner had brownies. Our Oni had browners. Our owner had brownies. But inevitably, we would have people come in and say, I'd like 2 chili dogs with onions, I'd like 2 fish burgers, and a couple tacos, and a large Coke. We don't sell those. In fact, we were the first McDonald's to sell the fish sandwich because our owner said, if that many people want a fish sandwich, baby, I'm going to sell them a fish sandwich. So we started selling these fish sandwiches that they sell now with that tartar sauce. You can choose whatever you want, but if it's not on the menu, it doesn't make any difference. Nobody stops you from choosing, but if it's not on the menu, it doesn't help. I mean, a man can choose to be a woman. Good luck with that. You can have surgery, but you're still a man with or without the proper parts and plumbing. I don't care what Chaz Bono says she is, she's still a woman. A fat, ugly one who talks like a man. But you can change all of that. She was born a woman, and that's what she is. Men can't choose to have babies. It's not on the menu. You can choose whatever you want from the available choices. So, for example, for an impenitent sinner to love God is not on the menu. When God changes his heart and his nature, all of a sudden it's on the menu, and you will choose it. Even if a man is determined in his choice by some prior cause, it doesn't inhibit his freedom to make that choice. It is your choice, and you're responsible for it. Doesn't do any good to blame Adam and Eve. Doesn't do any good to say, well, if you're right and Adam chose for me, how come I'm blamed? Because of the doctrine of federal representation. You were in Adam when he made that choice. God picked the perfect man and put him there, and he fell. How well do you think you'd have held out? And then he put the perfect man, Christ. Notice the differences in the circumstances. He puts the perfect man, Adam, in paradise, and he can't make it. He puts the perfect man, Christ, in the wilderness, and he does. We used to have a saying in football, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. It's not the circumstances. It's how committed are you to doing what Christ says. Edwards said it is absurd to suppose the will at present to be otherwise than at present it is. You cannot be inclined one way and choose the opposite way. But what can a sinner do? I can't help it. Oh, you can. The same feet, and we'll get to this in a couple of weeks, but the same feet that take you to the tavern could have taken you to church. You just didn't want to go to church. The same hands that pick up salacious literature can pick up a Bible. You just have no inclination to pick up the Bible. The same lips and tongue that tell profane jokes can say to God, God, please change my heart to love you. I don't have it in and of myself to do so. Now that's the only prayer a sinner can pray that God will hear. Because according to Psalm 66, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me, and the prayer of the wicked is an abomination to God. But you can say, God, please change my heart. And then God will say, go where my word is preached. Not where they have the best music program, not where they have the best youth program, not where the kids get to go rafting on the weekends. Go where my word is preached faithfully fearlessly and abundantly, because faith comes by hearing somebody preach Christ. It's not within a man to choose contrary to his nature. The unregenerate man can only sin. He can sin more or he can sin less, but one thing he cannot do is not sin. That choice is not an option for him because of his love for sin and his desire to please his father, the devil. How embarrassing is it that sinners are more faithful to their father than we are to ours? How does that shame us? Jesus said to them, "You are of your father the devil, and you want to do his will." Sinners are 100% committed to the will of their father. Where's the professing believer that's like that? The application of all of this is the death blow to Arminian evangelism. The sinner must look outside himself for salvation, and for a changed heart to choose that which he now hates, God, and to hate that which he now loves, sin. As Jesus said, "You will not come to me that you might have life." He doesn't say you cannot. Thomas Watson said, "It is not men's cannots that send them to hell, it is their will nots." You will not come to me that you might have life, which is exactly what dead men need, and which is exactly what unbelievers should pray for. Edwards saw the problem so clearly, it's a wonder anyone has dared to argue about it with him since that time. Well, let's close in prayer.